everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into some seriously thought-provoking stuff today. We've got a collection of articles and interviews all tackling one central question. Is liberal democracy fading away?
Yeah, and right off the bat, our sources today don't exactly paint the most optimistic picture, They really delve into the state of things, where we are and where we might be going, and it's a little unnerving.
Yeah, I was going to say it's pretty intense stuff. So to kick things off, let's jump into this interview with Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and he comes out swinging, basically saying, liberal democracy, it's already on shaky ground.
He really doesn't mince words, does he? He makes this point by arguing that corporations and oligarchs, they've kind of seized control. It's like we have the look and feel of a democracy, the elections, the speeches, but
behind the curtain, it's a different story.
Exactly. He even goes back, suggests this isn't something new, this gradual erosion. He traces it back to, the Carter administration.
And he doesn't let either party off the hook, right? Blames Democrats and Republicans for feeding this power shift.
Oh, absolutely. And this kind of leads us to his view on the 2024 election, a potential second Trump term. He frames it as this clash between, two sides of the elite, right?
Right.
The corporatists, your Democrats, who want stability, and then the oligarchs, the Republicans, who, they kind of thrive on chaos.
It's funny, because it reminds me of something I read about Aristotle, how he warned about oligarchies. Didn't he say they always end up in either tyranny or revolution? I mean, where do you think we are on that spectrum?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Definitely something to keep in mind as we dig deeper. And Hedges doesn't stop there. He goes on to talk about, the rise of fascism, and it gets a little unsettling.
I think fascism, and I picture jackboots and swastikas, the classic imagery. But Hedges argues it won't be like that this time.
Yeah, he says we should be looking for more subtle things, like the use of religious symbols, extreme patriotism. He even compares, some figures in the Trump administration to, and this is a heavy comparison, the German Christian church under the Nazis.
Wow. That's a heavy comparison. So what does he see as the driving force behind this rise of fascism, this potential rise? Is there a root cause?
He points to economic despair. He argues that traditional liberalism just hasn't delivered for the working class, and he blames both sides, again, Democrats and the Republicans, saying they've both fueled this growing economic inequality that's basically a breeding ground for, extremist ideologies.
And he talks a lot about wokeness, too. Seems like he sees it as more of a problem than a solution.
Yeah, he uses wokeness pretty critically. He brings up, for example, how corporations, they'll champion diversity initiatives, right? While simultaneously doing things that exploit workers or contribute to that economic inequality we were just talking about. It's a distraction, a way for the ruling class to keep their power.
That makes me think of something specific I saw at one of Trump's rallies. There was this moment, a prayer was offered, and they said, "No weapon formed against him shall prosper." And it just struck me, how religious language can be so intertwined with political power.
Oh, absolutely. That's a perfect example. And it ties right into Hedges' concerns about the Christian right. He sees them as playing a key role in this movement he describes and argues they're backed, heavily backed by billionaires who stand to benefit from their influence.
So if Hedges is right, and we're headed down this path towards oligarchy, even fascism, what can we even do about it? Does he offer any solutions?
He's a big advocate for radical action, He believes that those traditional forms of protest, like marches and demonstrations, just aren't enough anymore. He's calling for mass mobilization, especially through labor strikes, real disruption to challenge the system.
So basically hit the pause button on business as usual and force a different kind of future.
Exactly. But even even Hedges expresses a lot of pessimism about whether the left can actually pull this off.
So that's Hedges' pretty bleak outlook, and now I'm curious to see how it lines up with some of our other sources. We also have this panel discussion to the point that brings in a global perspective. Should be interesting to compare.
Yeah, and that panel discussion really zeroes in on this restructuring of the U.S. government.
Yeah.
Specifically, Elon Musk and his role in, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency.
Right. DOGE. I know our listeners are probably pretty familiar with Elon Musk, but maybe not with this fictional department. The panel seemed particularly worried about DOGE's access to sensitive government data, potential conflicts of interest, and the whole targeting of agencies that don't align with Trump's agenda.
Yeah, they specifically bring up the dismantling of USAID as a prime example. The U.S. Agency for International Development.
Seems pretty drastic. What's the potential fallout from something like that?
Well, the panel argues that pulling back from foreign aid, especially on that scale, could have some pretty devastating global consequences. They suggest it could create this power vacuum that China would be more than happy to fill, leading to even more global instability.
Which is already a huge concern, like
Yeah.
everything's unraveling at once.
Right. And the panel sees these actions, the government restructuring, the withdrawal from foreign aid, as a major shift in U.S. foreign policy. They think it could weaken key alliances like NATO and really raise questions about global stability in general.
So we've got Hedges painting this picture of a democracy in decline, potentially giving way to oligarchy, even fascism, and then this panel ringing alarm bells about America turning inward and what that means for the rest of the world. It's a lot to take in. Where do you even begin to process all of this?
It's definitely a wake-up call. We're looking at multiple perspectives here, but they all point to the very real possibility of a shift away from democracy, not just in the U.S., but globally. And I think these experts are urging us to really pay attention, think critically about what's happening, and consider what it means for all of us.
Heavy stuff indeed. Let's give everyone a minute to absorb all of that, and when we come back, we'll explore what, if anything, we can actually do about all of this. How do we face these massive challenges? Stay tuned. All right, so after that last segment, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. Like, where do we even begin to address all of this? Should we be stocking up on canned goods, building a bunker?
I think we can hold off on the doomsday prepping for now.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It's easy to feel powerless when we're talking about these huge systemic issues. But I think that's exactly why we need to dig into what Hedges is suggesting we do about it.
He's all about radical action, right? He thinks those traditional protests, they just aren't cutting it anymore.
Exactly. Marches, demonstrations, they're important for raising awareness, sure. But Hedges argues they don't actually disrupt those systems of power that he sees as the root of the problem. So instead, he calls for, well, mass mobilization, especially through labor strikes, as a way to really challenge the status quo.
I'm curious about this idea of corporate totalitarianism that Hedges talks about. It sounds pretty intense, almost like something out of, a dystopian novel. What does he even mean by that? And do you think it's an accurate way to describe where we are?
Well, he uses that term to describe a world where corporations have this overwhelming influence over our lives, not just through what we buy, but also, their control over information, shaping public opinion, their lobbying power, and how they often prioritize profit over people.
Like how corporations lobby governments to weaken environmental regulations or labor laws.
Exactly. Those are prime examples of how corporate interests can directly impact our lives and, potentially undermine democratic processes.
And the To the Point panel, they seem to share some of those concerns, especially when they talked about Elon Musk and his role in Doge.
Right. They brought up how Musk, with all his wealth and influence, is now heading this fictional department, the Department of Government Efficiency, Doge, and they questioned whether our traditional checks and balances, the things we rely on in a democracy, if they're even strong enough to handle that kind of concentrated power.
So let's say, for argument's sake, we buy into Hedges' argument. We need to push back against these powerful forces. How do we actually do that? He seems to think traditional protests aren't effective anymore.
Well, he's advocating for a more, confrontational approach, something that disrupts the flow of power, forces those in charge to really pay attention. And he believes that mass mobilization, specifically through labor strikes, could do that. Imagine workers across all these different industries, transportation, healthcare, education, all walking off the job at the same time. That kind of coordinated action it could bring the economy to a standstill. Send a really powerful message that the people demand to be heard.
But isn't that incredibly difficult to pull off? I mean, it seems like it would require a level of unity and organization that I just haven't seen in a long time.
Oh, absolutely. It's a monumental task, and Hedges himself acknowledges this. He points out that the left in America that's currently fragmented, lacking strong, unified leadership that would be needed to organize something that big. He even goes as far as to say that the left is incapable of mounting any serious challenge to corporate power.
Whew. Okay, so where does that leave us? If the traditional protests aren't enough and the left is too weak to organize a massive labor movement, is there any hope for change? Are we just stuck in this downward spiral?
I think it's important to remember that historical change often comes from unexpected places. Think about the civil rights movement, the fight for women's suffrage. These movements, they faced huge challenges, setbacks, but ultimately they succeeded because people refused to give up. They found ways to build coalitions, organize effectively, and challenge the status quo, even when the odds were totally stacked against them.
That reminds me of something Hedges said about the sacrifices involved in these kinds of movements. He talked about the history of labor movements in the U.S., how workers often face brutal repression, even violence, in their fight for basic rights. It makes you realize that change rarely comes easily.
Absolutely. Hedges isn't romanticizing revolution or anything. He's acknowledging the very real risks and sacrifices involved. And he argues that we need to be willing to face those challenges head on, to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's difficult, even dangerous.
So let's say, hypothetically, we manage to overcome all these obstacles. We build this powerful, united front that Hedges is talking about. What would be our goals? What will we be fighting for?
Well, Hedges doesn't really lay out a detailed roadmap, a utopian future or anything. But he does offer some guiding principles. He talks about dismantling the systems of oppression that have brought us to this point, systems of corporate dominance, economic inequality, and the political structures that reinforce all of that. He envisions a society where power is more evenly distributed, where workers have a genuine voice in their workplaces and their lives, and where basic necessities, things like healthcare, education, housing, are guaranteed for everyone.
That sounds like a pretty radical departure from where we are now. How realistic is it to think we can achieve that kind of transformation?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? There's a question that's been debated for centuries. Some believe incremental change is the only way, while others argue that nothing short of a fundamental restructuring of society will really address these problems. Hedges seems to fall into that latter camp.
And of course, there are always those who believe the system is just too powerful to change at all. They might even say that this talk of revolution is dangerous and destabilizing.
Right. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to wrestle with these complex questions, consider different perspectives, and ultimately decide for ourselves what kind of future we want to build.
So where does that leave us? What can we as individuals do right now to make a difference? It's easy to get caught up in the big picture and feel kind of paralyzed.
I think it helps to break it down into smaller, more manageable actions. We can support organizations and initiatives that align with our values, advocate for policies that promote economic justice, environmental sustainability, democratic principles, engage in conversations with our communities, online, offline, about the challenges we face, the solutions we want to see.
And maybe even have those tough conversations with family and friends who see things differently. Try to understand where they're coming from, find some common ground.
Exactly. Those conversations can be uncomfortable, sure, but they're so essential for bridging those divides that exist in our society. We have to find ways to connect with people who see the world differently and try to build a shared understanding of the challenges we're all facing.
It's starting to feel a little less overwhelming now. Instead of getting lost in the enormity of it all, maybe we can focus on taking those small, concrete steps that align with our values and contribute to positive change, however we define that.
I think that's a great approach. Even those small acts of resistance, when enough people do them, they can create a ripple effect that can really shift the balance of power. By speaking out, organizing, supporting each other, we can create that pressure that forces those in power to listen and respond.
It makes me think of that Margaret Mead quote. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. It's a good reminder that change is possible, even when the odds seem impossible.
It's a powerful quote, and I think it really captures the spirit of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's not about waiting for someone else to fix things. It's about each of us taking responsibility for creating the world we want to live in.
Okay, so we've talked about Hedges' call for radical action, and we've explored some of the challenges and possibilities there. But there's another layer to this conversation that we haven't really unpacked yet, the global implications of what's happening in America. Remember, the To the Point panel, they were pretty concerned about America turning inward and the consequences for the rest of the world.
Yeah, they raised some valid points, especially about the potential weakening of NATO. It's been so important for maintaining stability and security in the West for decades. And they argued that if America steps back from its global commitments, it could really embolden those authoritarian leaders out there and increase the risk of conflict.
And we can't forget the humanitarian side of things either. They talked about the potential fallout from cutting foreign aid. What happens if U.S. aid is no longer able to provide that support to countries in need?
Right, it becomes a moral question as much as a strategic one. If America steps back from its role as a global leader, it could have devastating consequences for people all over the world who rely on that support, for their very survival. It raises questions about our responsibilities to each other as human beings, regardless of where we live.
So we've got this multi-layered crisis unfolding, right? A potential decline of democracy here at home, the growing power of corporations, global instability, and humanitarian emergencies. It's a lot to process.
It is a lot, and I think it's important to acknowledge the anxiety and uncertainty that people are feeling right now. I mean, the world feels like it's changing so fast, and it's hard to predict where we're headed. But I think it's in these moments of uncertainty that we need to hold on to our values, our principles, even tighter.
And that's where Hedges' message about saving our soul comes in.
Right.
Even amidst all this, well, doom and gloom, he keeps coming back to this idea of personal integrity, refusing to compromise our values, even when it's easier to just go along with the crowd.
Exactly. He's saying that moral courage is essential right now, and it can be contagious. When we stand up for what we believe in, even in small ways, it can inspire others to do the same. And all those individual acts of courage, multiplied across a community, a nation, even the world, can create a powerful force for change.
So it's not just about changing the systems, it's about changing ourselves too.
Yeah.
Becoming the kind of people who can build that more just and equitable world.
That's a powerful idea. And it suggests that we all have a role to play in shaping the future, regardless of our circumstances. We can choose to be agents of change, to stand up for what we believe in, and make a difference in our own communities and beyond.
That's actually a really inspiring thought. Even in the darkest times, hope can be found in the actions of individuals.
And those actions can take many forms, volunteering, organizing, advocating, educating, creating, resisting. Every act of courage, every voice raised against injustice, it all contributes to building that brighter future.
So we started this deep dive by asking, is liberal democracy fading away?
And while we may not have definitively answered that question, I think we've uncovered something even more profound.
What's that?
The power of individual action and the importance of holding on to hope, even when faced with these daunting challenges.
I love that. It's a great point to transition to the final part of our deep dive. Join us after a quick break.
So, we've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff, right? Like threats to democracy, the rise of corporate power, and all this happening while the world feels increasingly unstable. And one thing that really stuck with me from that To The Point panel, it was how worried they were about things like NATO weakening. They were saying that America turning inward could have this ripple effect and make the world a much less stable place. Yeah, it's like this delicate balance, For decades, the U.S. has been so involved in global affairs, and those panelists were basically saying that stepping back from that could have all these unintended consequences. Like, they pointed out how organizations like NATO have been crucial for preventing conflicts, maintaining that sense of security, especially in places where things are already tense.
And they weren't just worried about, military conflict, right? They also brought up the potential humanitarian fallout from cutting foreign aid, specifically dismantling USAID.
Right, exactly. They highlighted all the work USAID does in providing crucial support to developing countries, helping with things like poverty, hunger, disease. And the panel's argument was that if you withdraw that support, it could be absolutely devastating for millions of people who really depend on it, for their survival. And it makes you think about the moral implications of these choices, Like, what's our responsibility to help those in need, even if they're far away?
It almost feels like we're at this crossroads, doesn't it? Do we prioritize our own national interests and just look inward? Or do we try to embrace a more global view and keep engaging with the world, even if it's messy and complicated?
It's tough, right? There are no easy answers.
Yeah.
I mean, on one hand, focusing on domestic issues, fixing things here at home, that's a strong argument. But then again, we can't pretend we don't live in this interconnected world.
Right.
The choices we make, whether they're about what's happening here or what's happening over there, they have consequences that go way beyond our own borders.
It's just a lot to wrap your head around. We've got these potential threats to democracy here, corporations gaining more and more power, and then this global instability and humanitarian crises on top of everything else. It can feel pretty overwhelming,
Right.
What can we even do to make a difference?
I think it's important to remember that even with all of this, all this complexity, uncertainty, there's still room for hope. Remember what Hedges said about saving our soul. It wasn't just about big political movements or anything. He was also talking about personal integrity, about holding on to our values, our principles, even when things get tough.
Yeah, it's like he was saying that even if the world feels like it's falling apart around us, we can still choose to act with courage, with compassion. We can choose to stand up for what we believe in, speak truth to power, support those who are fighting for a better world.
Absolutely. And those choices, those acts of courage, They might seem small on their own, but they can have a ripple effect. They can inspire other people to take action, to join a movement, to make a difference in their communities.
Thinking back to everything we've talked about today, it feels like we've come full circle in a way. We started by asking if liberal democracy is fading away, and while we didn't exactly come up with a definitive answer, I think we found something even more important along the way.
Oh, what's that?
We rediscovered the power of individual action and the importance of never losing hope, even when faced with these huge, daunting challenges. Even when the world feels like it's teetering on the edge, we still have the power to choose how we respond. We can just sit back and watch, or we can actively participate in shaping a better future.
I love that. That's such a powerful way to put it. And it really resonates with me. In the end, it's not about waiting for someone else to save us. It's about each of us stepping up and doing what we can in our own way to make the world a little bit brighter, a little bit kinder, a little bit more just.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks to everyone for listening. We'll be back soon with another exploration of the ideas shaping our world. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep believing in the power of hope.